people of the United States. A house divided against itself cannot stand. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Hello, and welcome to George Washington Slept Here, the civic education podcast from Freedom's Foundation at Valley Forge, where we explore American history, civics, and the idea of liberty through conversations with some of our favorite thinkers, writers, and leaders. I'm Jason Rea, Chief Operating Officer at Freedom's Foundation and host of George Washington Slept Here. Our format is simple, a long-form conversation with a friend of Freedom's Foundation where everyone can learn something new. Before we go any further, a little housekeeping. We encourage everyone to subscribe to George Washington Slept Here wherever you listen to podcasts and make sure you get every new podcast as soon as it is out. We love hearing from our listeners, so please email us at gwshpodcast@gmail.com with your comments, questions, and suggestions. Today's interview is with John Yoo, Emanuel Heller Professor of Law at the University of California, Berkeley. Hello, John.
Hey, Jason. Great to be here.
Great to have you. Our conversation today is going to be structured in a way to keep us on track. We want to explore your origin story. How did you become the person sitting here before us? And your current work as a law school professor, writer, and commentator. And then I want to talk about the state of America today. And finally, we end with a quiz. So, John, tell us, where were you born and raised?
I was born in Seoul, South Korea, but I was raised here. So I grew up in the South New Jersey suburbs, and I grew up in the Philadelphia suburbs. I just woke up this morning, and it took me about 17 minutes to drive here because I was driving fast. Came down the road. I've been driving down the Schuylkill Expressway for the last 41 years. So I'm from here. I remember wandering around Valley Forge as a little kid. Endless grassy fields they seemed to me back then, and so it was wonderful to be back.
Well, that's great. So you were born in Seoul. What brought your family here to the United States, and then specifically to the greater Philadelphia area?
So Korea at that time's hard to imagine now that Korea, I think, is the 10th richest country in the world. But back when my parents left, it was poorer than North Korea. It was a time of great poverty, and it was a military dictatorship, though an ally of the United States.
Right. It's not until 1989 that they become a democracy?
That's right. Not till 1989, right after the Olympics.
Right.
And so my parents wanted to come somewhere where they would have greater political and economic freedom for them and their family. Now, I've always been interested, actually, how immigrants choose where to go in the United States, because they could go anywhere.
Right.
So, and a lot of them don't know a lot about the United States. They get their impressions from, the most unusual sources. So my parents liked classical music, which is still very popular in Korea. Mm-hmm. And at that time, in the 1960s, the Philadelphia Orchestra was one of the greatest orchestras in the world, and there was a conductor named Eugene Ormandy, one of the great conductors of the 50s and 60s and 70s. And so they picked Philadelphia just because they thought, well, if it has a great orchestra, then the city must be great too. It was very funny. I was like, I'm glad you didn't like the Detroit Orchestra.
Right.
Which was also a great orchestra at the time.
So many things that could drive that kind of decision. You hear about, we had family there, there's a community there, someone from our village lived there and wrote back and told everybody this was a great place. But your parents, it was the orchestra.
Yeah, well, also because this is not like those other stories that you hear with, I think, immigrant families that came because my parents are, I think, in that first wave of Asian immigration right after the 1965 Immigration Act. So there were no other people to ask where to go. There were no other communities to follow. I think most Koreans live in Los Angeles and New York.
Okay.
Yeah. But actually, I think the LA Orchestra wasn't very good back then. But they could have picked New York, I suppose. But Philadelphia suited us just fine. We're really happy that we came here.
That's great. So who, as you're growing up here in the United States, who were the most important influences who would sort of help you make decisions as to what you were going to do and become?
I went to a high school, starting in middle school. I went to a school called Episcopal. which actually has moved out farther to here. But when I went to it, it was on City Line Avenue, which is right on it's called the City Line Avenue because it's right on the border between
Literally,
Philadelphia.
on one side you're on Philadelphia, you cross the street and you're outside of Philadelphia.
Yes. In a town called Marion, which also, so we had the schools that had funny locations right across from St. Joe's University. And then right next to it was the Barnes Foundation. So it was right next to this crazy old man's house who happened to fill it with billions of dollars of worth of impressionist art. And then our school was right next to it. So that school had a big impact on me. I would say there's a teacher there that had a particular impact on me named John Plant, who was the teacher of Latin and Greek. So I took 6 years of Latin and 5 years of ancient Greek there. And he had the most extraordinary life. He was British and dressed like he was British. You know, he looked, you could tell he was like off of Masterpiece Theater every day.
So plenty of tweed.
Yes. Yeah. But he had been a soldier under Bernard Montgomery at El Alamein.
Oh,
wow. Amazing story, which he didn't ever tell in class. I only learned it after. And then he stayed in Egypt and became a professional golfer and married one of the daughters of the royal family who was an artist. I know you can't make this stuff up. And then ended up being, a Latin and Greek teacher here in Philadelphia. His career took him all the way to here. So he was a wonderful influence. And then, of course, a broader culture. I grew up during the time of Reagan.
Right.
And I think Reagan had Reagan and the Reagan Revolution, even though I was a teenager at the time, had a profound influence on me.
And of course, culturally, you and I are both growing up at the sort of height of the Cold War. And Reagan and Gorbachev and everything we did was sort of defined by that in very real ways.
Yes. Well, part of that is very real for my family because we're in a way we're in the United States because of the Korean War, right. The first conflict of the Cold War. But yeah, I think people forget how ever-present and important it was. I still remember elementary school doing a nuclear bomb drill.
Sure, the duck and cover.
Yeah, which when I then went to college and studied history of the Cold War was just so ridiculously silly.
Yes,
given how destructive.
Yes, it was never going to do anything.
Yeah, and I remember learning as a kid that Philadelphia had the major refinery on the East Coast, so it was a number one target in any war. So it was so ever present and important part of life. Yeah. I think that it's unlike anything today. I think.
Right. Yeah. And defined us in ways that it's hard to imagine. And it certainly makes sense that you and many others went this sort of foreign policy, this interest in foreign policy, because so much of our lives was defined by it. So you decide to go to Harvard after you leave Episcopal. What drove that decision? And then eventually law school at Yale. And so you're at that point, it feels like you're on a track.
Yeah. So I went to Harvard because it was just for Asian families the best school, the one they'd heard of.
Right.
Even in Korea in the 1960s, they'd heard of Harvard. And it was funny because I didn't feel I got a very good general education until my senior year.
Interesting.
So in the first early years, actually, I studied American history. I majored in history. So I studied all the stuff from the colonial period all the way to the 20th century. But then my senior year, I decided to try to go out and get a better general education. And that's when I encountered people. I didn't even think of them as being conservative at the time, but people like Samuel Huntington or Harvey Mansfield, Daniel Bell. I had classes with all of these amazing people who I guess today they would be thought of as neoconservatives now.
Right.
But back then they were offering courses on, introduction to political theory, American exceptionalism, democracy, topics that I just was naturally drawn to.
It's interesting that it took to your senior year to find those professors but you did. And so I'm wondering if that is what that senior year experience at Harvard and finding these professors are what pushed you toward law, or were you already thinking about that? How did going to law school sort of figure into your plans?
I I had thought about going to law school while I was in college, but I didn't think about becoming a practicing lawyer. I thought about being a scholar. I could just as well have gotten a PhD in history. And I remember talking to the assistant professors who do all the work at the Harvard History Department to teach all the classes, do all the advising. And I remember talking to them about it. And they said, oh, no, go to law school. It's too hard to get a history teaching job anymore. And certainly someone interested like me in like the founders and military history, diplomatic history, they were like, you'll never get a job in a major American history department. So they said they gave me great advice. I mean, I'm really glad that I followed their advice, but because law allowed me to combine the stuff I'd learned in history, but with all these theories about social science that I picked up my senior year.
Right. So you end up at Yale Law, and unlike it seems a lot of people who are going into law in the 1980s, you're looking at the Constitution, you're looking at the foundations of the law in some really philosophical ways, as opposed to I want to be a trial attorney who gets rich and has a boat and a vacation house and all of that stuff.
Sounds pretty good now that you describe it. I really went the wrong direction there. So so first of all, Yale is really different than the other law schools, although I didn't know it at the time. Again, back then there was no internet. There was no books about how to pick law schools. Or colleges.
Maybe you got a flyer from somewhere. But
I mean, the shocking thing is I probably learned a lot from just talking to people who are a year ahead of me in school who also know nothing. So there's a lot more information available now. But what I didn't realize was Yale, really the professors, their main interest is in teaching people to become professors. But it was very interesting. So it was basically, and some Yale professors would say this, it was basically like a PhD program for lawyers who are going to go into legal teaching.
It's really a PhD in the law as opposed to.
And so I don't know if I would ever hire a Yale graduate to do any legal work for me. But I would certainly enjoy talking to a Yale graduate about ideas.
Right. So that's really interesting. And I think those of us who sort of not been to law school and sit outside of it, those nuances are really interesting, that there are schools that are more philosophical like Yale. There are schools that are more about trial and the how-to, and everywhere in between. So you finish your law degree, and I know you do a couple of clerkships, but you end up in the Department of Justice for the Bush administration and the Office of Legal Counsel. How did you wind up there, and what was your job as legal counsel to the Bush administration?
So I was a professor at Berkeley right after my clerkships, and so I wrote about war powers because I was interested in diplomatic history from college, and also maybe because I was a product of the Korean War, I've been interested in war, just the study of it. And the way a lawyer thinks about it is very boring compared to the way other people think about it. Like, we don't think about, is going to Vietnam a good idea? That's not the lawyer's job. Is it legal to go to Vietnam?
Right.
And when I was in college also, and this is not untypical for Cold War history, I did my dissertation, my thesis, and a lot of my classes on the Cold War, and that historiography is very much focused on the presidency.
Right.
I mean, at that time in the 80s, actually, you've got a picture here of Eisenhower on the table. Eisenhower was the big thing at the time because his archives had just been opened. So the focus on the presidency and their decisions is the way a lot of Cold War history was done then. And so when I got to law school, I studied the presidency. When I became a law professor, my major article in the 90s was about the president's war powers. Not most, I would say 95% of law professors think that most of the wars we've had are unconstitutional because they think Congress has to decide to go to war first, which has not really happened in most of our wars since 1945. So that was what I wrote, and so it would be natural to hire me to work in this office because this office exists to advise the White House and all the other federal agencies on the Constitution.
Okay.
Yeah, it's extremely important yet extremely obscure office where there's probably never been a head of the office who's ever spoken on TV at a press conference.
Right. That's
or
not
even,
their job is not out front. It's
Yeah.
it's in the back office.
Yeah, you'll see like when they announce the prosecution of someone, they'll have like 10 people standing behind the attorney general, down to the guy who wrote the complaint, wrote the indictment, but there won't ever be a head of this office on TV.
That's interesting. But you've come out of this Yale tradition. You're teaching at the University of California, Berkeley Law School. And we know that in your time there, 9/11 happens, and you are called upon to write a memo essentially on what does the Constitution say about combatants outside of the United States. What does the Constitution say specifically about the interrogation of those individuals? And there's this question of, does the Constitution apply to them? What does international law say? What are our treaty obligations? And it's all in the context of a war, a very strange war is being prosecuted, because this is not a state-to-state war that, we can traditionally look to in history. This is, very different. So what was your charge in writing that memo, and what conclusions did you come to?
The 9/11 attacks caused us to have to rethink how the laws of war applied to a different kind of enemy. So during the same period, we also had the war in Iraq.
Right.
Didn't have to rethink anything. Right? As you said, that's a normal state-to-state war. Geneva Conventions apply. There's a whole books and books about what the army in the field does.
Right. You've got soldiers in uniform.
Soldiers in uniform fighting for in a command structure with a civilian, a leadership and territory and cities and borders.
Right.
And so 9/11, we encounter a group, not a nation, no cities, no territory, no population, no uniforms, no units. They don't fight in a conventional manner. In fact, the way they fight is a violation of the laws of war. Their main tactic is to attack civilians, which is the core principle of the laws of war is to distinguish between civilians and combatants so you don't hurt civilians.
Right.
And so we had to sit there, and I think the weight of the legal part of the government fell on our office, because that's what we do. We think about constitutional and legal issues, and this was unprecedented. So the first thing we had to decide was whether it was a war at all. There were people who thought, well, terrorism until 9/11 had been treated as a crime. And we give an example. There was a bombing of a destroyer called the USS Cole.
Right, in the Persian
just the
Gulf?
year before. Yep.
Right.
And our first action was to send out the FBI to secure what we called the crime scene and to conduct an investigation. And that's just not a partisan. That's just how every administration had treated terrorism up until 9/11. And so first we had to decide whether it was a war. We decided it was. And then we had to decide, well, how do the rules change when you fight a group, not a country, a group that hasn't signed the Geneva Conventions, doesn't obey any of the laws of war? So we actually looked at historical precedent, like the American Revolution, like the Civil War, times where the United States had fought groups, not people. So that's where the interrogation issue. So actually, first issue is detention. The first question that came up was, we're starting to capture these people. Do they get to live in a POW camp like the kind you would see? This is going to date me. The kind you see in Hogan's Heroes, where they live in barracks and sort of wander around,
right.
and so, or can we keep them in cells?
Right.
Which is a criminal justice approach, but which is prohibited actually by the Geneva Conventions. That was actually the first issue we had to think about. Second issue was, can we use drones to attack them behind the lines? You can't do that in the criminal justice system. You can't shoot suspects who are not threatening anybody. But in military warfare, you can bomb enemy bases well behind the scenes. So we approved drone strikes. And then the third one is detention. If you capture people, can they just say, oh, my name, rank, and serial number is so-and-so, which is the Geneva Convention system? Or are you allowed to interrogate them in a tough manner? And so we decided legally you could because they were outside the Geneva Convention framework. You couldn't hurt them, but you could, right? You could try to pressure them in psychological ways. That's the view we came to. And so ultimately what the CIA and the Defense Department suggested was, why don't we use as interrogation methods the same system that we use to train our own soldiers? And they said, we would not actually do anything that would hurt our soldiers.
Right.
So we're not actually going to harm any of them, but it's a way of pressuring them because these people, and this is one last difference, I think, between fighting the enemy who's armed, uniformed, and in normal conventional units and terrorists who want to hide in the civilian population and kill civilians, is the only way really to get intelligence and to try to see what they're going to do is through the information in their heads and through surveillance of their communications. They're always trying to blend in with the civilian population. So the normal things you would do, like surveillance from the air, surveillance from contact, intercepting, it doesn't work because they don't operate in normal units. They don't have normal conventional goals. So if the objective is to try to stop future attacks, we decided, well, that was a legitimate way to try to get information to stop them.
So, and I know part of what the memo argues is specifically about Fifth Amendment, which is due process, and the Eighth Amendment, cruel and unusual punishment. And if I remember correctly, you sort of come out and say Fifth doesn't apply, Eighth does in the cruel and unusual part, but that does not prevent you from being able to, subject them to the kind of interrogation that is going to reveal the information that will save lives.
Well, the larger constitutional question there is, does the Constitution protect members of the enemy during wartime abroad? And this was actually where we looked at things like the Civil War and the Revolutionary War. In our view, and this actually was the view the Justice Department had taken for many, many years, was that it would be impossible to apply the Bill of Rights to members, not just possible, but illogical to say, the Bill of Rights applies to enemy soldiers who you're fighting on a battlefield, who you're allowed to shoot, if you're fighting them, but they would have the right of free speech. It just doesn't make sense. And actually Lincoln, it was very interesting. I found a letter that Lincoln had written about this very question, because at the very outbreak of the Civil War, there's a case that comes out of Baltimore, at the very beginning of the Civil War, because the North is trying to get troops down to Washington, D.C. to protect it. There's a strange break in the rail line. The railroad, for some reason, stopped in Baltimore, and then you would have to march or walk to another train station and get on another train to go from Baltimore to Washington. And Union troops were attacked by Confederate sympathizers in that walk at the very beginning of the Civil War. And so Lincoln orders the military in Baltimore to try to arrest the people who are the heads of the Confederate sympathizers. Chief Justice Taney, the author of Dred Scott, happens to be in Baltimore at this time.
Yep.
And he orders their release under a writ of habeas corpus. And Lincoln...
Is this Merriman?
Yeah, Merriman case. Yeah, we talked about that. And Lincoln refuses. He just doesn't answer Taney. So it's actually, I think, the only case where a president has refused to obey a judicial order. And then later Lincoln says, Taney's decision makes no sense. Lincoln was caught in something, though, because he always said that everyone in the Confederacy was still an American citizen.
Right.
He would not admit that they were another country. But at the same time, he said, we're fighting a war with them, and we have to follow the rules of war. And he said something like, otherwise, what if I was walking in Washington, D.C., and I saw Robert E. Lee walking down the street? I can't do anything to him unless there's a jury trial that finds him guilty. He said, no, of course. Or Stonewall Jackson. He said, no, of course not. Of course it's a war. Should be able to detain them right away. They wouldn't have normal constitutional rights because we're in war.
Yeah.
That was the basic constitutional question we had to answer that underlies all of these memos and all these questions is under the pre-9/11 world, we had treated it like a crime, and so terrorists would get due process rights like under the Fifth Amendment. But if it's really a war, we don't give Bill of Rights protections to the enemy because you couldn't fight a war. You couldn't shoot them. You couldn't fight a normal war. I think the legal question actually was not as hard as the political issue, because I think today even a lot of people in society think, oh, we've overreacted to 9/11. Terrorism really isn't a war. It really is more like a crime. We really should just use the standard criminal justice system rules. Like, why don't we read the Miranda rights when we arrest, what people still call arrest them?
Right.
But that's that's the sort of law and order framework on how to deal with crime, not how you deal with war.
Right.
So that's the fundamental decision we had to make on this.
So I want to focus a little bit on Crisis in Command, which is your book on executive power. And you start at the very beginning with the Articles of Confederation, Constitutional Convention here in Philadelphia, even Federalist Papers and the debate around ratification. Tell us what the framers thought about executive power, and then what's your thesis of how executive power is either redefined or expanded in certain presidencies.
What struck me about the way lawyers had been writing and thinking, or constitutional lawyers had been writing, thinking about the executive power, is that it was somewhat divorced from, I think, the 18th century way of thinking of executive power, which was much more attached or connected to political theory. And you could say maybe this is one of the most important questions about political theory as applied to constitutions, is how do you have a active, energetic government, but one that doesn't become a tyranny? Right? There's something that the political theories people have been thinking about since early ancient Greek times. Now, Aristotle talks about it. So one thing that I thought important to do was to understand what the executive power, which is actually the phrase used in Article 2 of the Constitution, creating the presidency, was to recapture what did people at the time who thought about these things, participated in the drafting and ratification of the Constitution, what would they have understood the executive power to be? If you read constitutional law case books, you would think it was only about firing people. That's what all the Supreme Court cases are about. It's just, can the president fire people? Which is important for control of the administrative state, but it almost ignores the major question, which is, what does the executive power mean in terms of the president's constitutional authority that lies outside the authority of Congress? Just like we think of what does the judicial power mean, or the legislative power mean? And so that's one thing I tried to do was, and then I thought of it as the executive has two aspects. One is structural. What the founders decided to do was to vest it in one person. Mm-hmm. Another structural thing they decided was not to have the executive chosen by Congress. The president was responsible and elected by through the mediating structure of the Electoral College to the people.
Right.
And so they wanted to have a president who was independent of Congress, but someone who could act with vigor and speed and energy in the terms of the Federalist Papers, because that's why you had it in one person. There were proposals to have it placed in two people and make it like a Roman consulate where each one could veto the other, and is specifically rejected. And then the other question, I think, on which constitutional law people had shied away from was, what were the substantive powers of the presidency, not just its independence? I think of that almost like, I call it in the book, I think, the human resources version of the president. Presidency is just about management of the executive branch. Right. And I think the harder question is, what powers do we give to the president in a way that are just all concentrated in that word, the executive power, but aren't really enumerated in the text? And so here I was very much persuaded by Alexander Hamilton. I noticed you have a building named after him when I drove in. And Hamilton has this, he talks about this in the Federalist Papers, particularly Federalist number 70, starting there and on. But actually, I think his most important thinking about the presidency is in this debate that occurs right after the founding called the Helvidius and Pacificus debates. This is a fascinating debate because it is about whether President Washington could declare neutrality in the French Revolution. And so in the Constitution, there's no discussion of foreign affairs. There's power to start wars. There's a power to make treaties. But there's no power there to say, oh, we're going to be friendly to you, or we're not going to be friendly to you. The power to conduct diplomacy is not mentioned. And so the two great collaborators, Madison and Hamilton, take opposite positions. This is what's so wonderful about this debate. So Hamilton, as is typical, went first. And then he was so great, he called himself Pacificus, that he's the peaceful one. And he immediately took to what was the form of debate then, which was publishing pamphlets under pseudonyms. And he made this first argument, which I think has been compelling ever since, which is Congress's powers in Article 1 are enumerated. The first sentence of Article 1 says the legislative powers herein granted are given to Congress. So it's an enumerated list. Hamilton says Article 2 doesn't say that. Article 2 just says the executive power is vested in the president. So he says from the start, the Constitution gives the president the executive power, but doesn't define it.
Right.
It's not limited. And so then he says, well, how would we figure out what that means? So he said, let's look at the powers that executives have always had under our system, and then think about the powers the Constitution deletes specifically. So he gives as an example treaties. Under the British Constitution, the king made treaties alone. Under our system, the president and Senate make them together. So he said, every time that happens, of course, we delete that from the executive power. But then he says, everything that's left, we assume rests with the president. So he says, so the president gets to decide neutrality because declaring the foreign policy positions of the country has always been. And so the great thing is he looks back, it goes through Blackstone to Locke. I think it actually goes all the way back to the first modern political theorist, who was Machiavelli. Mm-hmm. Although Hamilton would never associate himself with Machiavelli, his vision of the executive really traces its way back all the way to Machiavelli. And so that's essentially how I approach. So I always often say I didn't come up with any new theory here. I'm actually quite a Hamiltonian, and I'm actually in a way filling out the Hamiltonian theory about the executive for modern times.
You had, of course, at the heart of that debate is how much power should the executive have? And you have this very early in the book, there's this great line, and I apologize if I don't have it perfectly, but you said, basically the framers saw that the executive needed to be strong enough to promote the common good, but not so strong as to risk despotism. So, but I was struck by that common good. There is this idea that the president's job is to promote the common good, that it is a singular person, but that is what has to be the guiding principle in every decision that the president makes.
Yes, it's about, the primary job the president has is protecting the nation.
Yes. So
you have to have a vision of what the public good is, and then executing the laws. And we give the president a lot of discretion in how to execute the laws. The laws are sometimes written very generally or in a very vague manner, and we expect the president to take and execute those laws in a way that promotes the public good too, that he not waste money pursuing, personal petty, biases or fights, and try to implement the laws in a way that's best for the country as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to ask this question because you spend a fair amount of time on it. So the framers lay out in Article 2 executive power. As you've said, it's unenumerated. And then George Washington comes to be elected. And we specifically named this podcast George Washington Slept Here because of this idea that he's the great uniter, that he's the one person who everybody in those early days of the Republic and particularly after the Constitution that drew everyone together, that people who disagreed on every other thing looked at George Washington and said, well, if General Washington says that this is the way we need to go, this is the way we need to go.
Except for that scoundrel, Thomas Jefferson.
Yes, well, but even at the beginning, he was on board. But
it only took about 2 years for Jefferson to turn on him. Actually, 1 year. 1 year, yes. Jefferson's already up to no good.
But he really defines executive power in decisions that he's making in that first year, 2, 3, 4, of the appointments that he makes, of his refusal to consult Congress. Tell us about George Washington.
Well, I think George Washington... So I think he doesn't get the credit in popular culture that he should, or even by historians that he should today. But actually, he makes a lot of fundamental decisions that have shaped our country and shaped the presidency that didn't have to be made that way.
Right.
So just one example is from the very beginning, he creates a cabinet government where he, the president, is the head, and he appoints the cabinet officers. Think about the way he could have done it, the way it's done in Britain. Mm-hmm. He could have thought of his government as a coalition of the parties in Congress and tried to get leaders from each coalition to become cabinet members, and then try to think of cabinet meetings as a way to harmonize the majority party's different coalitions to one policy.
Right. And ultimately to advance bills in Congress to become laws.
Yes. And that the basically think of the president as a prime minister, as basically someone who works for Congress or just happens to run the majority party in Congress. Washington comes in and he actually organizes the presidency in a way that's familiar to him, which is running an army. Mm-hmm. And so he thinks of the cabinet officers as subordinates.
Right.
He doesn't think of them as equals. He gives them directions and orders, instead of consultations with his cabinet officers. When he has questions like the French Revolution question or the National Bank question, these very early questions, he asks for the opinions. And we still have them in writing because they used to write them down and send them to the president. But he thought it was still his ultimate decision.
Right. He's the decider. Yeah. Everyone else is giving advice, yes, but every decision is his decision, which keeps everything in. You don't have multiple decisions being made or oppositional decisions being made.
This is what Hamilton actually lives up to the Hamiltonian vision expressed in the Federalist Papers, is that if you have the power concentrated in one person, then everyone knows who's responsible.
Right.
One of the things they worried about with cabinet government is that no one would be able to tell who made that decision and who's responsible.
Absolutely.
And that's another thing. Washington takes responsibility for the decisions. He explains why he does things. One of the things that Washington doesn't get as much credit, I think, is he doesn't leave behind the paper trail of a Hamilton, Jefferson, or Madison, of voluminous writings. Washington's not a thinker; he's a doer, and so he makes decisions, I think that's how he shaped. So the presidency as we have it today is the presidency that Washington designed. There were many possible presidencies that could have been created out of the constitutional text, where the president is far more subordinate to Congress. But Washington, from the beginning, another good example of this is how presidents treat the advice and consent function of the Senate. Mm-hmm. So in two places, the Senate is actually part of the executive branch for the making of appointments of officers and judges, where in England that had to be done by the Crown, and the Constitution, the president nominates, and then with the advice and consent of the Senate, makes the appointment. And then treaties, again, under the Crown in Britain, that was solely the king. In the U.S. Constitution, the president makes the treaties with the advice and consent of the Senate. And so there's this famous example. I mean, you could have read that text. A different president could have read that text and said, oh, I better bring the senators into the White House and we should have a general discussion about who would be a great Supreme Court justice or whether to make a treaty. And then I'll go do it consistent with what we discuss. Then I'll come back to them and see if they like what I did. Washington tried that once with the treaty. So the very first treaty, and this is all in Philadelphia because that's where the government was in the beginning. It's all been downhill since we moved it out of Philadelphia, by the way. Clear, it would be great to have cheesesteak-loving members of Congress. It would solve a lot of problems in our government. So then Washington walked across the street from the executive branch house to Independence Hall, basically, right? Or what they called the Pennsylvania State House at the time, where the Congress was meeting. And he tried to take the advice of the Senate on whether to make a treaty with the Indian tribes. And he only got to ask one question. And then apparently from the records we have, 3 hours ensued of arguments and yelling and debates amongst the senators. So in other words,
Congress hasn't changed in 250 years.
Exactly. And so Washington had a terrible temper, and he worked all his life to keep it under control. He eventually at the end stormed out of the building and was heard to say, I'll be damned if I ever step foot in there again.
Yeah.
And After that, no president has ever stepped foot in the Senate to take its advice on the making of a treaty or the appointment of a Supreme Court justice. This is a good example. Washington instead turned it into, I make the choice, and then I send it to the Senate for approval after my choice to formalize it. I'm not going to invite the Senate to make the decision jointly.
Right. But what that also creates, and what, part of the legacy that George Washington leaves us on executive power, is there's now a double check. There is the advice and consent and the vote of the Senate on those things. But then there's also the election of the president, that if they are unhappy with his foreign policy, or they are unhappy with his choice for judges, or they are unhappy with any of those decisions that he's making as president, and this is the advantage of having a sole individual, they can vote him out.
Yes, this in fact. So again, this reinforces the Hamiltonian vision. The president is singularly responsible for the decisions of the executive branch. He can't hide behind the Senate, which is what could have happened if you had thought of the nomination or the treaty-making power as a kind of collective decision between the two branches.
Yeah. So George Washington sort of cast the mold. Who are some of the other most important, presidents in helping us better understand those unenumerated powers of executive authority?
Well, even though I was just calling him a scoundrel, which he was, Thomas Jefferson is a good example. I actually think the main theorist of executive power in our history, and that's the book I'm working on right now, is Alexander Hamilton, who was far more important than jumping around singing songs on a Broadway stage.
But a lot more people know who he is because of it.
I'm glad. Yeah, I'm glad of it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm glad of it. But it's interesting. I haven't watched the Broadway musical, but still, I think Hamilton is always thought of a man of action. Right? Even in the play, he's presented as a person who does things. The guys in the room making the decision. But I actually think he's more important for his thought. And actually, that's what I'm writing my book about, because there are very few books actually about Alexander Hamilton as a thinker, which is surprising given, I think, I think we actually live in Hamilton's republic.
Yeah. Oh, no question.
Without a doubt.
No question.
Not Jefferson's.
Yes.
But we don't think of it that way. We're like rhetorically a Jeffersonian republic. But anyway, so and actually this goes to your question, because Jefferson creates the first political party in our history, and that political party is designed to defeat the Washington Party. He's a great critic of things that Washington has done. But when he comes into office, and Hamilton predicted this actually, he said, when Jefferson becomes president, he will be a great friend to executive power. And he turned out to be so. I think the greatest, this is interesting, the greatest act, I think, of Jefferson's presidency was the Louisiana Purchase.
It's funny you mentioned that, because one of the things we do here at Freedom's Foundation with our high school program called Spirit of America Youth Leadership is often we will have a debate between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. It's like meeting. They're really, really wonderful.
Amazing.
And we've actually, are going to have an episode with the interpreter who does Thomas Jefferson. But what's really interesting is in their debate, and the students are there watching and they're able to engage with questions. But one of the keys of disagreement between these two is whether Thomas Jefferson acted legally in making the Louisiana Purchase.
Yeah. Well, so Jefferson doesn't think so, which is that. But as with many ways, Jefferson, being an intellectual, figures out a way to do it anyway. So Jefferson actually had a view of the Constitution which I don't think is correct. But he did believe it, which was, if you were going to acquire territory from which you were going to draw new states, you should amend the Constitution. So his hypothetical was, does this mean otherwise that the United States could just absorb Holland as a new state just by passing an act of Congress? He said, no, it's such a fundamental change in the political bargain that there should be a constitutional amendment. So when the Louisiana Purchase possibility comes up, he actually drafts constitutional amendments to purchase Louisiana, because that's what he believed is constitutional matter. Then he heard that Napoleon was thinking of backing out of the deal. So then they just rushed through buying Louisiana. And so after his presidency, Jefferson is asked, how could you do this? You actually violated your own view of the Constitution. And so Jefferson, it's interesting, Jefferson said, and this is actually a different view than Hamilton, but actually in some ways I think a much more expansive view of the presidency. So actually I think more than I might hold. He said the president sometimes has to violate the Constitution and the law if the public need is great enough. And then he said, this is what we call the prerogative, which is something John Locke discusses too. And then he said, and then the only way to check it is to ask the people after I do it to approve me, to give their approval.
Right.
So Jefferson actually thinks executive power includes the authority to violate the Constitution.
So that's a perfect segue to Abraham Lincoln, because there is that same sort of question, much more important than just purchasing a piece of property, no matter how large it is.
Although it was at a good price.
Well, it was like
Americans love a
15
discount.
cents an acre or something. But with Lincoln, it is this question of the power to hold the Union together. And you have this great analogy that actually I think is a Lincoln analogy, where he says, you can sacrifice a limb to save the body, but you never sacrifice the body to save the limb. This idea that, yes, he may have to exceed what was envisioned as presidential power in order to hold the Union together, but that is the job of president. And so it's this really interesting conundrum.
Yes. I mean, this is, he could have gone the Jeffersonian route. And sometimes he would say things like that, as the quote you mentioned, or he'd say, are all the laws but one to be violated, and I have to enforce this one law, which in the case he was talking about was the writ of habeas corpus, and let the Union fall to pieces. Right. And so he would make comments that referred to this Jeffersonian idea of the prerogative. But my argument about Lincoln is that the way, and this is one of the reasons he's a great president, maybe even greater than Washington, or at least on a par with Washington, is that he says, no, I'm not going to ever claim that the Civil War is such a great an emergency that the Constitution doesn't apply. So we're still going to have a Congress. We're still going to have elections. We're still going to ask Congress to raise the taxes and to spend the money and to decide how big the army is, and I will respect the constitutional limits of my authority. I'm not going to claim a vast prerogative. But we said, what I will do is say that the executive power, in the way that Hamilton argued in Pacificus, it can expand during wartime to protect the country from this one-of-a-kind threat, a civil war, which is not even discussed or anticipated in the Constitution. And so here, so I think the one clear example is the Emancipation Proclamation.
Right.
Maybe Lincoln's greatest act within the war was to free the slaves. But he didn't claim, as president, I'm just going to free the slaves during wartime. Instead, he treats it as a war measure. So, for example, it only applies in the areas of rebellion. People may not realize that he did not free the slaves in the loyal areas of the North. And he realizes it's only temporary during the time of the fighting. That's why he wanted the 13th Amendment enacted, because that would permanently eliminate slavery for all time. So Lincoln actually carefully exercised his power as president, even while rhetorically he said, I might have to do extraordinary, potentially even unconstitutional things. He tried never to do that.
So I have two more questions specifically about executive power that I want to get to. One is, tell us what the lesson of Richard Nixon is when it comes to executive power, because unlike those who you list as the great presidents who helped define it, Richard Nixon is the exact opposite.
I have such a soft spot. He was a very smart, capable guy. I mean, in terms of experience and intelligence and training and background, but so hated too by the intellectual class. So basically my argument in the book and since has been, presidential power is flexible. It expands to meet the moment. If there really is a true emergency like the Civil War, then executive power expands to give the president the powers necessary to deal with the emergency. What I think Nixon's constitutional fault is that he thought he was an emergency and he was not. So he made claims for vast executive powers and then he turned them inwards on the country.
Right.
And I think that was his key mistake. And I think that So you could say there's two kinds of mistakes presidents could make. One is, I point to President Buchanan, thought of as the worst president in American history, unfortunately, from Pennsylvania.
Yes.
So
Our only one.
Yeah, is that right?
I think so.
Oh my gosh. So Buchanan did not rise to the challenge of the Civil War. He did not understand executive power to be broad enough to handle the greatest threat to the security of the country. He actually thought that the president had no authority to stop the Civil War, to stop secession, even though he thought it was unconstitutional, just like Lincoln did. So that's an example where he did not expand the power of the executive to treat an emergency properly. Nixon's the reverse example. He expands presidential power. There was no emergency. That he was paranoid in that sense. He thought there were these plots and efforts to get him. When in reality, what he did is he used these vast presidential powers over national security to interfere in domestic politics. That was his mistake.
Right. Because there is, and you allude to this and directly speak to it in the book, that foreign policy is specifically presidential, and then the execution of laws. But it is interesting once we start getting into domestic policy, where the Venn diagram of legislative power and presidential power and what is each is bailiwick, which one gets to my last question, which brings us right into I think specifically into the modern era, is the question of executive orders. And tell us about how do executive orders fit in to executive power, presidential power, but then also the weakness of them and where they are appropriate and where they maybe aren't appropriate.
Yeah. So I think of the Constitution as creating reverse polarities for the presidency in foreign affairs and domestic affairs. So in foreign affairs, the president acts first. Congress often follows. The initiative is in the president, and the president sets the policy, develops a policy, sets it and executes it. Congress provides the money and the resources. Think about it. Domestic policy, exact opposite. Congress is the main policymaker. Congress goes first. The president comes in at the point of the veto, and then at the implementation of the laws, second, not first. And executive orders are efforts by presidents to make policy at a level with Congress in a way, to try to assume in domestic affairs some of the initiative and authority they have in foreign affairs, which I think the Constitution really wants them to be the exact opposites almost when it comes to domestic and foreign affairs. So there are some species of executive orders which are perfectly harmless and are not controversial, which is, for example, Congress passes a law, it has some ambiguous terms in it, and the president tells the executive branch how to carry it out. So many executive orders are just the president directing the Justice Department or the Department of Health and Human Services to just carry out a law in a certain way. Every president has to do something like that. But the executive orders we've seen with more and more frequency are different. They are executive orders where presidents say, Congress has refused to pass a law, so I'm just going to do it anyway because that's my policy preference. So I'll point to two. One was the Biden effort to cancel all student debt in the country.
Right.
I think that's clearly up to Congress and the power of the purse. And
the
President
Supreme
Biden
Court
lost.
has agreed with you.
Yeah, the ultimate president. I am picking executive orders that the Supreme Court struck down, right? So right. But that's. So I think that is a kind of executive order which represents an unconstitutional expansion of the presidency in domestic affairs. Obviously, Congress could cancel all student debt if it wanted to. They've passed no law to do so. And so for the president to say, I'm just going to make this major decision about spending and the money that's owed to the Treasury, just because there's – in fact, it's very hard to identify what power Biden claimed he even had to do it, which is why he lost so easily at the Supreme Court. But this is, I think, a dangerous trend. I think politically I see why this has happened. Anybody would, because Congress has refused to handle a lot of the important questions on which people are getting elected or not. And so the president feels if he doesn't do something, he's going to be punished by the voters. And so the president tries to fill that gap, as it were. But maybe this is a good place to talk about this in this setting is that's what the founders wanted.
Yes.
People don't realize the founders wanted a constitution that would create a government that made it hard to pass law. Right? They this is not part of the presidency part of the book, but in other parts of my work, I've stressed that the founders thought states would be the primary regulators of most things in life, and the federal government would just sort of step in to fix discrete problems or areas of the states couldn't handle. But the federal government was going to be specialized and narrow.
Right.
And so they designed a system where it would be really hard to pass laws. And so I blame all this is maybe conversation at a time. I blame this all on Woodrow Wilson and a little bit on Teddy Roosevelt. They had the vision. Well, if that's a obsolete constitution, we need to have lots of laws all the time because the society and the economy are so complicated. And so the president is going to step in and fulfill that lawmaking function that Congress can't perform under the Constitution. That, I think, is an important constitutional Rubicon that we crossed during the progressive era.
Right. Well, we definitely will have to have you back to talk about that. I think that's a great place for us to end this discussion. We do have a quiz. We do this quiz with
I thought that was the quiz.
No. This is here's the fun part. So, excluding Washington and Lincoln, who's your favorite president?
Oh, excluding Washington and Lincoln? Those are, but in my book, I say those are my two favorite.
I know.
Those are my
We
two.
don't let anyone pick Washington or Lincoln. It's too easy.
So I actually, despite the fact that I think he really did misinterpret the Constitution, I do give a lot of respect to Franklin Roosevelt.
Okay.
We will saving us in World War II.
We will definitely have to have you back and have that conversation. What's one thing you want every American to learn more about?
Oh, clearly about the founding.
Yeah.
Or the Civil War, one or the other.
Agreed. And yes. If you had not chosen a career in the law, what do you think you would have become?
Oh, I think I would have become a historian.
Okay. Yeah. Fair enough. Let's see.
I would have also, your idea of the trial lawyer with many boats and planes and homes holds great attraction.
But you would have gotten bored eventually. What pet peeve annoys you the most? And I ask this all the time because I have a million of them. We were talking the other day about the way email search functions work, that I type in something and it'll spit out something from 2013, but I can't find the email somebody sent me last week.
So I have something a little more, maybe this is more university-based, but I hate what we call the gratitude sandwich. Do you know what that is?
No, tell me.
So this is every time someone below a certain age, this is definitely a generational thing, asks a question. They say, "You're such a wonderful person. Why do you come here and say such a stupid thing? But thank you so much for coming here." Right? Every question is phrased in this gratitude. And I just I was actually just teaching a class the other day. And I just said, well, remove the buns.
Yes.
I don't want to hear how great I am. I don't want you to tell me how great it was.
Tell them you've gone gluten-free. Yeah. All you want is the meat of the sandwich.
Just ask me your direct, harsh question. And we'll save 67% of the time of this session.
I love that. Oh, that's great. What one book would you recommend to listeners?
So given my Roman Greek training, I would say Thucydides' Peloponnesian War is worth everyone reading.
Okay, excellent. We will have to put that in the notes. Do you have a favorite movie? And it doesn't have to be the favorite of favorites, but you know.
I mean, I like Star Trek a lot. But I would pick Star Trek II: Wrath of Khan.
Yeah, that's probably the best one. It's funny.
With William Shatner screaming Khan.
Yes, yes.
One of the great.
And Ricardo Montalban.
Ricardo Montalban.
Yes. What one thing about you would most people be surprised to learn?
I don't know how handsome and good looking I am, or what a wonderful athlete I am.
That's right. You played
discrimination and taste in all matters. Which one of those would you pick?
Part of the reason I know you is because you played youth soccer with a mutual friend of ours.
Yes, Steve Target.
Yes.
So, but I was not very good at soccer, I have to say. But I think of our time when we were growing up, that was when parents figured out, just throw all the kids onto a field and let them run around till they're exhausted.
Right.
It was a good form of child care.
Final question, bourbon or scotch?
Oh, bourbon.
Okay.
Because America.
Yes, absolutely.
No, I mean, they're very similar, so why not just buy made in the USA?
I love it. John Yoo, thank you so much for being on our show. Great having you. Great discussion. If we're lucky and the stars align, maybe we'll get you back this summer to do one of our teacher programs. We're going to be at Liberty Hill. We would love to have you be part of that. I also want to thank our producers, Laura Kennedy and Sarah Rasmussen, and a special shout out to friend of the pod, Bill Franz, for his artwork, and for historic interpreter Bob Gleason for his contributions to the intro. Please subscribe, follow, rate, and review George Washington Slept Here wherever you listen to podcasts, or email us at gwshpodcast@gmail.com, or visit us at freedomsfoundation.org. Thanks for now.